Hi, Bill, and
To see you. Nice to see you.
thank you for being with us today at the LeadFit Forum here in Sofia. So tell me, if you had to put 25 years of work into three lessons for leaders, what would they be?
Well, first, good to meet everybody virtually, and thank you. It's probably longer than 25 years, and so we'll see how this sounds to you. Um, I think the most important insight overall that I've come to anyway is that um, many people ask, what are the tools? What are the tools and ways to operate that really make a difference here? What are the right tools? And I say to folks that the really important insight is that it's not about the tools, it's about the tool user. In other words, it's about you. That the leverage that leaders have is their own attitudes, their own mindset, the story they have inside their own head about the people around them. And that the powerful transformation that makes the most difference is realizing that. Now, invariably, you see um, dangers in the situations around you, and you see obstacles as well as opportunities. But the main opportunity is not uh, so far away. So let me tell you a story that sort of gives you a feeling of that. I was sitting some years ago with the leader of a large wildland firefighting organization, a big organization that was the best in the world at the time in the United States at fighting fire across the entire country. And I had a question for him. And the question was, what is the problem was that there were increasing numbers of fatalities, increasing numbers of people getting killed in these contexts. So real safety problem. And the question I asked him was, what's your fatality budget? How many people are you planning to die next year? And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. Like, I'm not planning on having anyone. I said, well, I don't think that's necessarily quite right. If we look at the last 10 years of how this is performed, in other words, if you look at a factor of interest, in this case, fatalities, over the last 10 years, it's done what? It's gone up. He said, that's right. I said, all things equal, what's it going to do next year? He said, it's going to go up. I said, right. Why? Not because you intended, but because this system has momentum. Systems have momentum. The question is why? So we spent some months talking to people all through the organization, more than 1,000. This is a 40,000 person organization. We talked to 1,000 people in one way or the other through workshops and interviews and so on. And it became very clear that the attitudes of the people, not the physics of the situation, not the lack of process, was the core challenge. People were seeing procedures as the issue, but they weren't understanding that the way they operated was itself fundamental. They took a different attitude, and that changed the situation massively. They shifted from safety processes to what we ultimately call the safety culture, which was a shift in how they saw everything. So the way they crossed the street when they weren't at work changed from do whatever to be completely aware and completely aware all the time. So the leverage is not actually in the procedures and processes that you add, and they had piles of them, but in the attitudes of the humans, starting with the humility of the leader to say, I don't know why it looks this way, but I can't live with it being like this anymore. So that was one incredibly important and sort of vital lesson. Another big one that is super critical, I think, is the environment in which people function, what we sometimes call, for lack of a better word, the container in which conversation, in which innovation occurs, massively determines the outcome. There's a very well studied now term called psychological safety that a colleague of mine at Harvard, Amy Edmondson, talks about. That's a little misleading. We're not really interested in safety. We're interested in safe danger. We're interested in places where people will take risks. How does this apply to leaders? It applies in the sense that you as a leader have the job of creating an atmosphere in which something different can occur, in which the habits and routines that you and everybody else brings to your situation is interrupted, which implies back to the U-turn of the people. People have to start asking themselves the question, what do I need to do differently? There's a good story about Nadella taking over Microsoft when they had just become, at the time, the largest company by market cap in the world. They're no longer that. I think NVIDIA is winning on that one these days. He said he had a company of know-it-alls. Everybody in the company knew the answer to everything. He said it was a complete disaster. We need learn-it-alls. We need people whose commitment is to not knowing. Again, how do you generate a commitment to not knowing? By having leaders who are prepared to model that. Rarely do you have people walking around saying, I don't know. You're paid, you're the high paid help. You're supposed to have the answers, not the questions, right? But if you think about it, that's ridiculous. We're facing so many different pressures these days, competitive pressures, environmental pressures, political pressures. No one has the answer. And every time you ask people, you get different answers depending on who you ask. A committed attitude of learning is far more potent. We need to become learners, not knowers. So those are the three big changes. The recognition that you, as a leader, are the fundamental source of leverage. Second is that the environment, the container in which the conversations are occurring, has to be cultivated, curated, and very deliberately created to produce an outcome different from the one you already have. This implies, by the way, that meetings can't just be meetings in the same way. I can go back to that in a minute. They have to move from meetings to conversations. And that's a kind of fundamental thing. And the third point, again, is to move from being knowers to being learners.
Tell me what conscious leadership means for you.
As we were chatting earlier, it's not my most favorite term because it kind of implies that there's a lot of unconscious leadership. There may well be a lot of unconscious leadership. That's true. But when people don't walk around thinking, I'm unconscious. You think you're aware, right? So it's a sort of a peculiar one. I prefer a different term, which is also a little bit problematic, which is identity-based leadership. And by identity, I don't mean outer identity. I don't mean the package of the where you're from, ethnic identity or gender identity or political identity or any of that. I don't mean any of the outer trappings. I mean the identity of being, the identity of who you are, not the package that it comes in. And I think that distinction is very fundamental. We talk about the distinction between the light and the lampshade. The light is the light. We are perceived by ourselves and others through a lampshade. And what most people call identity, they're talking about lampshade. What comes through it, and it's either clear or opaque, depending on the situation. I think identity is more rightly connected to the light. So a story that illustrates that from a slightly different context than the ones that I've been mentioning before. In 1955, in the United States, in Montgomery, Alabama, there was a woman named Rosa Parks who was sitting on a bus. And it was about 6 o'clock at night. It was a cool evening. And the buses in that time were segregated, white only and colored only. And there was for Black people. And there was a section in the middle that was often floated, that the back of the bus was meant for colored Black people and the front for the white. And she was in the middle. And the bus started to fill up. And at 6 o'clock, the bus driver asked her to move to the back. So at 6 o'clock, Rosa Parks was doing this. sitting. At 6:01, this is what she was doing. Sitting. People say that leadership is some kind of great outer action, right? A great speech, organizing lots of people, leading people over the hill to capture the flag or defeat the enemy. In this case, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat, her simply sitting without any outer change at all, had a gigantic impact and catalyzed the civil rights movement in a very particular way. As she later put it, and people said, well, her feet got tired. She said later, my feet weren't tired. I decided to act, she later said, the way a free woman would. Free woman is free. She acted out of the identity of being free. And that had massive reverberation and impact. Why? Because it was the inner identity, the inner being showing through. And for 70 years, that's reverberated. The other key insight from that story that's worth knowing is that she wasn't a coincidence. She had been trained for some years to learn how to hold that understanding in all kinds of circumstances, including under pressure. In other words, while this may be an insight you could have about yourself and your situation, it's not something you can instantly bring online. You have to develop the muscle to do it. You have to learn how to do it, which seems odd that you have to learn how to be yourself. You have to learn how to be centered in who you are, no matter what the outer pressure or outer disturbance. And that takes learning. Anyway, she'd gone and done that. So the true insight here is not just that this is sort of a moment that catalyzed a social movement or a civil rights change, but a story about cultivating leadership at a much more profound level. Act the way a free woman would. Act the way a free human being would. What's the seat you shouldn't give up becomes the question that I'm exploring and that I encourage others to explore.